Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. So yeah, this is the first of three. So I've got three on painting. This one's on portraiture. Monday is landscape, and then Tuesday is abstraction, all at 6 o'clock. So three 20-minute bite-sized contextual studies lectures. And the first one is on portrait painting, and it's titled Capturing the Human Spirit. And I think we'll kind of realize why that's a good title as we go through, because I think, without giving too much away, that that's kind of the idea of portraiture, really. You know, this lecture it's kind of not about the technical approaches. It's about why we do it, what we're trying to achieve, you know, those kind of issues, as well as looking at some fantastic portraits. I'm going to kick off with that. Sorry. And this is a slightly unusual place to start, but it's me. Sorry. I think with these lectures, quite often we look at painting and make reference to photography. And the reason that is interesting is it makes us realize, you know, the strength of each medium and what each medium is trying to sort of do, because they're kind of a bit opposite sort of to each other in some ways. So photography is a good reference point, I think, for a lot of painting discussions. And the reason I put this one in, because I think the passport photograph is a really interesting thing. And when we're talking about portraiture, we're talking about intention. What is the intention of the portrait? You know, what does the portrait painter trying to do? And the passport photograph is fascinating because the intentions are absolutely clear. You know, there's no wriggle room for this at all. So white background, you know, no shadows, no glasses, your head has to be a certain size, got to have your eyes open, all those things. So it lays down the conditions that are necessary, and then you take the photo and it fulfills the conditions. So it works or it doesn't. So the intentions are clear and it meets them brilliantly. Okay, and we'd call it's very objective. So if we're talking about capturing the human spirit, I don't think they do generally. I mean, we try and put on a bit of a smile and keep our eyes open, but hopefully this isn't capturing my human spirit. I'd be very worried if it was. So, yeah, this is on the objective end of portraiture, okay? So that, and the other thing I'm going to show you at the start is talk a little bit about the idea of conventions in portrait painting, and they're quite, you know, they're quite heavy and quite restrictive, I feel, in many ways. So here on the left, we've got Godfrey Kneller's portrait of Dr. John Radcliffe, painted in 1700. And on the right, we've got 317 years later, we've got Binnie Matthews' painting of Patricia Daly, who's an Oxford Don. So these are what we'd call kind of like authority portraits, institutional portraiture. Okay, so these are, for politicians, for academics, people working in institutions, basically. And there's a convention. We can see the convention here is pretty obvious, isn't it? You know, we've got like a 3/4 length portrait. We've got the hands are important, you know, and the proportions are very similar within the frame. And this is the standard kind of convention. Okay, here we can see very little progress in composition or form, but we can see progress in subject matter. Okay, because obviously in the olden days it was all generally sort of oldish white men, yeah. And now we've got Patricia Daly, who is a woman of color, who's an Oxford Don, 2017. So we can see that conventions have really stuck, and it always amazes me how portraits struggle to get out of that. But yeah, subject matter, I guess, has moved on, which we'll see as we go further. So a couple of things to get us thinking before we start. So we'll do a little historical thing now. And we'll look at what generally, these are the first type of portraits generally. And they're normally frescoes, so they're normally painted on walls. So they have this beautiful aesthetic normally because they're a bit faded and they've got cracked plaster and stuff behind them. And this is obviously a Roman, you know, 1st century AD Roman portraits of Terentius Neo and his wife, we think. But I suppose the interesting thing for me is that, you know, the eyes are all a bit big, aren't they? They're massive. You know, so maybe maybe that was important at that time to have big eyes. You know, that was probably an important historical thing to show, maybe. But the interesting thing is that they're holding stuff. So I think again, this is what we'll look at when we look at this the issues in portraiture. They're trying to tell us something about themselves, and I'm not sure what these things are. It looks like a scroll. It looks like she might be holding I don't know, some sort of thing to make a mark or up to her face. I'm not sure what it is, but they're trying to tell us something. So it's not just about a likeness. They're trying to sort of, tell us a bit about themselves or their times or their importance. Okay, and I think this idea of what we have in the portrait or what we don't is actually vital in determining what the painter is trying to say. And then, of course, as we move on, we've got one of the most important paintings of all time, one of the best known, most written about, most sung about, most parodied work of art in the world, definitely. A masterpiece of the Italian Renaissance, Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Okay, and it's considered to depict the Italian noblewoman called Lisa del Giocondo. That's what's generally understood. And we talk about this. Again, there are conventions here. So it's a studio portrait, and we've got in the background, we've got a sort of studio type backdrop of a lovely landscape, you know, in Italy. And again, the hands, look, we've got that similar sort of convention. The hands are very important. And if we look at the hands, we can think of, and I want you to think about this in terms of the next slide as well. The hands, they're very soft and they're very, very relaxed. And they make her, they contribute to that idea of her being a very soft, a very gentle woman who's very sort of in control of things. Beautiful color palette. I mean, it's got sort of everything going for it. Some people have often said the hands are much too big, which could be, but hey, it's Da Vinci. We'll forgive him that. So let's stick with the hands. And when we come to this amazing self-portrait by Albrecht Dürer, the great German painter and printmaker, self-portrait at the age of 28. Look at that hand. Wow, that's the hand of a kind of artisan, of a maker, of someone who uses it a lot to do quite tricky stuff, I think. And it's quite twisted and it's quite gnarled. It's not the nice relaxed one of the Mona Lisa. Yeah. So hands are like absolutely critical in portraiture. And this is the wonderful Dürer, and obviously we have similarities here, relationships to the image of Christ. Yeah, so Christ would normally be depicted like this, I guess. You know, very strong central figure looking at the camera, and we've got this bit of the hand being raised to the middle of the chest is like a blessing, an act of blessing. Yeah, so this is clearly invoking Christ, and he looks a bit like representations of Christ that we have seen. Okay, so quite a lot going on in that one. There's a bit of text up there, which is again something to tell us a bit more about him. Very serious character. He's got a very good, very straight stare. Very strong, like focused individual. So I think it's, oh gosh. I mean, the issue obviously is we know a lot about Dürer now through various things. If I saw the portrait and I didn't know who it was, what would it tell us? I'm not sure it would tell us that much, So that's always the issue with portraits, and we'll come up against that as we go through. Extraordinary portrait from Rembrandt, 1655. We'll see in this lecture that there's a lot of self-portraits. And I think a lot of the greatest portraits ever made are self-portraits. And I think I'd like to think that is because artists know themselves quite well, so they can paint themselves quite well, and they can focus on things about themselves that only they know about. So that could be the reason. But this is Rembrandt's amazing self-portrait from 1655. Sad, really sad, heartbroken. So his wife died, and his children, he had financial woes, adding further sadness. So Rembrandt was in a pretty dire place at this point. So it's a very sad portrait. We can see it in his eyes. the expression on his face. So yeah, what's it telling us? A sad man, a man in a moment of sadness. Moving on, Gainsborough is a good example of a British painter who, these kind of history portraits, I think we'd call them. And we're getting into portraiture, I guess, at this point, which is a bit more like, society type portraits. So there's a fashion element here. So this blue boy here, who's we think is Gainsborough's nephew, it's like a costume study of what they'd wear in the 17th century. And it's similar to Van Dyck's portraits of young boys. So it's a kind of a bit of a rip-off of that. Again, we can, what's Gainsborough showing us? Confident young man or boy. Through the posture, it's quite strong. He's got the elbow jutting out. He's got the hat by his side. He's going to put that on his head. Again, it's that convention of the studio background. But we're getting something about a person of that age, I guess. A bit later. I mean, we'll find now. Up to that point, I suppose. Early 19th century, mid 19th century, things started to change a little bit. Up to that point, everything was very, very formal, and there was much fewer risks taken with portraiture and its content. And then, of course, along comes Van Gogh and just does something completely different. So he's telling a story here, isn't he? The amazing incident we know where he was, him and Paul Gauguin had a huge argument. Gauguin threatened to leave. Van Gogh loved having him there. Van Gogh approached him with a razor, and later that night, after Gauguin had left, he cut off his ear, and took it to a prostitute in Arles, supposedly, and showed her the trouble that he was in. It's a pretty crazy story. You can imagine it all happening. But we know about the story. It's perfectly represented in here. Van Gogh's looking very, very sort of like tortured and upset. But again, there's that side of it, but in the background there we've got a Japanese print on the wall, Japanese woodblock print. Look, it's lovely, and it's geishas in a landscape made by Torriquillo in the 1870s. So Van Gogh has enough attention to tell us a little bit more about himself. So it's not just a tortured soul, who's having a fight. He's got a bit of culture about him, and he wants to tell us about that. And we've got this point now where we're getting like these heavy brush strokes. So up to this point, the Mona Lisa, the Dürer, the Rembrandt, the Gainsboroughs, they're all beautifully rendered in terms of soft, continuous painted tones. Van Gogh's come in with that heavy brush strokes, giving a real sort of much more dramatic sort of effect. And then we got another big development here. Picasso, 1937, the famous Weeping Woman, part of Cubism. So we've got Cubism, early part of the 20th century emerging, and this will be Dora Maar, who was Picasso's mistress and muse. And these Weeping Women paintings were produced by Picasso in response to the bombing of Guernica by the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. So it's an image of pain and suffering, and using the Cubist idea of painting around the subject, 3 dimensions. So it's got that sort of action and dynamism, but it's also got real sort of content. More self-portraits. So Frida Kahlo, and this is someone now who's telling us about themselves a lot. So she's got, this is full of kind of like symbols and creatures and, black cat and monkey, dragonflies, the necklace of thorns. It was painted after a divorce from Diego Rivera, but full of content to tell us not literally about her, but kind of symbolically about the sort of character she is. And then another huge kind of shift in the 1960s, the beginning of like the postmodern period. We've got the wonderful Andy Warhol, who crops up everywhere. And this is the famous Marilyn diptych from 1962, portrait of Marilyn Monroe. And we've got 2 sides. The left-hand side is supposedly her celebrity life, representing her celebrity life. On the right, representing the darker side, and as she moves towards her tragic sort of death. So that's the feeling, and it's a screen print. It's very graphic. So again, goes against a lot of the conventions of early portraiture. We've got a little period now of I'm going to show you three artists who kind of were all friends working in London, and they've come up with some of the greatest portraits, I think, ever. And one of those is Frank Auerbach, and this is a self-portrait again, 58. It suggests, again, a bit of a Van Gogh, like deep psychological kind of like struggle. I suppose it's dark. It's like he's frowning, thinking. But again, I think we've got to ask that question. Does it tell us much about Frank Auerbach himself? Or, is this generally about the human condition? And I think that's probably where we are with portraiture, that generally it can only tell us so much, and it's more likely to be a comment on the human condition or the human spirit, as the lecture's title suggests. So the other ones, we've got Frank Auerbach, we've got Francis Bacon, of course, operating around that time, 60s, 70s. And there's quite a nice quote. I've done a lot of self-portraits because people have been dying around me like flies, nobody else to paint but myself. So part of a very traumatic, turbulent period of drinkers and people who came to untimely deaths. But Bacon's portrait is interesting, isn't it? Because it's movement, and it's kind of like, it's kind of strange colors, and it's a bit cubist, and it's a bit bonkers. So he's just telling, his life was like that. So I think that's what he's trying to show in his portrait. And then the third one of this, we've got Frank Auerbach, we've got Francis Bacon, and we've got the amazing Lucian Freud, of course. So this is a portrait of a very sullen, morose man, looking, he's handsome, intense, but he looks troubled. And again, he probably was, but so are an awful lot of other people. And again, this is more a portrait, isn't it? Of course, it's a brilliant likeness of him. It's brilliantly painted. But on the other side, we've got that representation of a human condition of moroseness, if you like, or difficulty, which is quite common, obviously, if we can see in these portraits. I just want to talk a little bit about how we read portraits, because in 1980, Roland Barthes wrote his famous book Camera Lucida, and he talked about a punctum and a studium. And the studium is a general interest in an image. So we look at it and think, that's quite interesting. The punctum is something in the image which, he said, pricks us or really interests us. Okay, and what he says about this particular photograph is, what interests me, strange to say, is the belt worn low by the sister here, and her strapped pumps here. Those are the things that he looks at and gets his attention. And from that, he makes a reading of the picture to do with, like, maybe the Sunday best, respectability, conformism. So yeah, he's reading, making wider readings from certain aspects, and that's what we do with images, but that's definitely what we do with some portraits. And a good example would be Chuck Close's. This is a photorealist self-portrait, 1968. Great painter, great photographer. And, he's trying to tell us that cigarette, the glasses, they are quite important symbols or signs. Roland Barthes would say they're signs for us to decode or reinterpret. So he's trying to tell us something about himself, not too much. The angle is interesting from low down, giving him some power. So he's quite powerful. He's like, I'm going to smoke. My glasses are saying I'm sort of like maybe intelligent. So he's trying to tell us about himself, not just about humanity in general. Coming up to 1992, this is the amazing Jenny Saville portrait called Propped. So again, we're looking now at representation of people who aren't, who kind of have things to say about their body and how they're represented. So Jenny Saville, a larger body, but she's like painted it with like a wide angle lens almost, large knees, large hands. She's looking kind of quite serious there. And there's some text over the top, which I'm not going to go into now. But yeah, they're just a different approach to portraiture. It's very self-revelatory, I suppose. And again, a self-portrait, of course, which we've sort of suggested might be the best approach. And here's Marlene Dumas, one of the fantastic contemporary artists who's done a whole series of portraits. This one's Ingrid Bergman, and this is a film star of some importance. And Dumas painting her like with tears or looking quite upset. So I think that's quite a statement, and this indicative of the way portraiture has moved, I suppose, towards emotional representation rather than just physical kind of representation. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about this one because it does raise some of the issues that we've talked about. This is the project by Graham Hurd Wood, which I think is a great project, but he's basically painting everybody in the Welsh town of St David's. There's 1,800 people there, and he's going around painting them all, and he's got about 1,000 done, I think. But I think it just gets to the point, doesn't it, that what are you trying to do? I mean, I'm not dissing this at all. I think it's a great idea, but you're not going to show the individuality of each person, are you? You're going to give a vague resemblance. You can't tell us much about them. So again, this is a collective portrait about a place, if you like, or So it works in some ways, but it has its limitations. But it's an interesting news story, I think, around portrait painting. Finish off with a couple of great contemporary portraits, and here we will see issues of representation. So this is Amy Sherrill, the amazing American painter, and here she paints all her models are black. This is a very famous black woman, Michelle Obama, painted in a very sort of like very stylish, very strong pose. Very in control. So she's responding to a million years of representation of powerful white people by putting Michelle Obama there on the pedestal. And she has these wonderful backdrops. So it is very much about a community of those underrepresented, the community, and putting them there in a powerful position. And a similar thing from Cehin Wiley, whose portraits are quite complex, but the portraits of young black people sort of enjoying relaxing, almost like on the ground, just enjoying being there. And this is all a response to those images we see of young black people, on the streets, usually with the police over them. Yeah. And so this is like getting back control for young black people. So very, very political, but not in a sort of ram down your throat type way. Yeah. There's gentle reference. And they're beautiful portraits, of course, beautifully painted, very, very colourful. A lot of those pictures of young black people struggling at the hands of police, gritty, black and white, grainy, dull, and this is the complete opposite of that. So we've seen in the last couple of paintings here that I think the bigger issue these days for artists is to show a more complex world, and to use portraiture to represent, the human spirit. Certainly Cehin Wiley here is representing the human spirit here, with this painting. So just to finish off, just some of the key points. Portraits should be read in the context of time and place, of course. That will change exactly how we read things. If we look back to that first one, that's kind of a very different constructions than the current ones. So they exist on that scale between the real and the imagined. So trying to paint a good representation, but actually there's a whole lot of imagination being brought to it. Yeah. Third point, there's a complex relationship between portrait painting and photography. So photography is you know, what we'd call an indexical representation of the person, of the image. Okay, so it is objective. It can be like completely a true likeness. Okay, and painting can never really be that unless it's kind of photorealist, but that's rare. Okay, so there is a complex playoff there. And this is a big one. Do they represent the individual, or do they represent humanity and the issues of humanity, the emotions of humanity more generally? So where do they sit on that line? And generally, the more information we've got, the greater the narrative. So the more things that are in there, the more we make up a story. Okay, so maybe it will be more about the individual if it's got more stuff in. The artist's style is absolutely critical, dictates the form of representation. So, you know, if we think about Andy Warhol, very particular style and strategy, and that is going to completely affect how he represents people. And generally, his most successful work is of people like Marilyn Monroe or Elvis Presley. You know, these people are in the media spotlight. Is the self-portrait the most authentic, revealing approach? That's a question. So we've seen some brilliant self-portraits, but we've seen some great portraits too. So that's up for debate. But you would imagine that artists know themselves quite well, so they could possibly paint themselves in a more authentic way. And the final one is the big thing, isn't it? Can the painted portrait really reveal that certain something about a person? So can it get in there? And what is that thing we're trying to look for? You know, is it the human spirit? Is it the fact that someone does a particular type of job? Is it the fact that they're very kind? Is it, you know, what are we trying to say? And can portrait painting really do that? You know. Anyway, lots of questions there. And we've seen some great portraits, so we're going to stop because we've gone well over our 20 minutes. But yeah, if anyone's got any thoughts to put in the chat, then I'd be very welcome to sort of hang on and see them. It's always interesting. But thank you very much for listening. And there was a lot crammed in there. I hope it was useful. And yeah, please join me on Monday for the landscape one. Yeah, if you've got anything to put in the chat, please do. I'll sort of hang on a bit.